Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I am going to explain how I created the rabbit with black fur. The fur is a little bit longer, and the techniques that are used to create that fur can be applied to other things, including human hair. Also, on my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have a written version of this tutorial, and that blog has the reference photo and a free pattern that you can use. I'll put a link to that in the video description. Well, let's get started. Transfer the pattern to the board, then use a writer pen tip and burn in the pencil lines around the eye. Make sure to use a light hand pressure. Afterwards, it is up to you if you want to continue to use a writer pen tip or use the side of a shader to burn in the rest of the trace lines. Again, make sure to use a light hand pressure. After the lines are burned in, rub over the area with an eraser to remove excess graphite. Face. Use a writer pen tip and burn in the pupil. Leave a band unburned for the subtle reflected light. Depending on the size of your rabbit, it might be easier to use a micro writer pen tip for this. I apologize now for the poor quality of video. I do promise that this video will not stay this way forever. Use a small shader and burn over the iris. Avoid the highlights on the eye as you work. After the iris is blocked in, then lightly burn over the right side of that subtle reflected light on the eye. I am using uniform strokes as my burn method for burning in the eye. If needed, reburn over the pupil to darken it up. The pupil should be a very dark brown or black color. Notice how I am reburning over the eye to slowly build up the color. I prefer working this way versus adjusting the heat constantly on my burner. With the heat setting, I tend to be a set it and forget it type of artist. This way of working requires a lot more reburning, but on the flip side, I make fewer mistakes. If you examine the reference photo, you can see that there are several areas of subtle reflected light on the eye. I chose to ignore all of them but one. It is up to you if you want to mimic what I'm doing or replicate the photo. If needed, use the edge of a sharp knife to remove any overburn from the bright highlight and lighten up the subtle reflected light. I will mention that working on the eye can be easier to do if you use a writer pen tip. The smaller nib makes it easier to be more precise with your burn strokes. Currently, I am burning a series of thin lines along the iris. The lines radiate inward towards the pupil. I do this on almost every single eye that I burn. It doesn't matter if it's animal or a person. I add these lines because I think they add a touch of realism to the eye. The last thing I did was use a shader and darken up the iris a little bit more. I concentrated the color along the outer edges of the iris. Use the shader of your choice and create fur texture on the face. I am using a zigzag burn stroke for this. Keep in mind, my zigzag burn stroke is not like a sewing machine zigzag. It is more like a bolt of lightning. I have a tutorial that goes into great detail on how to create short fur using zigzags. I will put a link to that tutorial in the video description. A lot of artists prefer to burn single lines to create fur texture. I wouldn't say that one method is better than the other. Both methods can produce great results in creating fur texture. Instead, I would say it is a matter of personal preference or what you are most comfortable with. Regardless of the method used, it is important to burn the lines in the direction that the fur is growing. I am using Colwood's J shader. Some people prefer to use an angled wire tip like the one that is shown in the inset photo. The reason is that the wire tip does not dig into the wood surface as easily as a flat shader does. If you use a flat shader, like I am, it is very important to use a very light hand pressure when burning. This will help keep the edge of that pin tip from sinking into the wood. I mentioned before that it is important to burn the fur in the direction it is growing. Another important thing to do is to keep your edges jagged. What I mean by this is that you should have some stray hairs that stick out above the rest of the hairs here and there. This will help with the realism of the fur. Now this rule applies to all edges. For example, the top of the head, or along the right side of the face by the ear, etc. Along the bottom of the face, there are a number of long white hairs. I create them by leaving gaps in my burn strokes. I burn zigzags over a small area, then I leave a thin gap and burn more zigzags in another small area. I only added these white hairs because the artwork was of someone's pet and they were going to get the artwork. Otherwise, I would have completely ignored the hairs and filled the area with the same texture as the rest of the face. After the base layer or first layer of fur texture has been burned in, then it is time for the reburning. This means I just reburn over the fur using the same burn stroke. I also reburn the fur in the direction the fur is growing. The burn strokes on the second layer are not going to match those with the first layer. Not only is that okay, but it is desirable. We want some of the color from the first layer to show through here and there. This gives the fur more tonal depth and adds to the realism. In addition to using the same burn strokes for the reburning, I also use the same techniques. For example, I leave gaps between my burn strokes along the bottom of the face. One thing that differs is that I am now purposely trying to leave the pale gaps the same as they were from the first layer of fur. The reason is that as the color adjacent to those gaps gets darker, the lighter in color those gaps will seem. This creates the white hairs, or at least the base for the white hairs. Make sure to keep a jagged outer edge on the white fur circling the eye. To do this, start a burn stroke in the dark fur and pull the pin tip down into the white fur. You can burn single lines or use the zigzag burn stroke. To break up the white fur a bit more, I tap the edge of the pin tip to the board. This produces very short, thin lines in the fur. As you can see, I've started reburning another layer of fur texture. Almost all of the animal fur I create in my artwork is comprised of numerous layers of zigzags. This allows me to build up the color and texture of the fur slowly. I like to think that this approach is a major contributing factor to the realism I achieve in my artwork. Make sure to add a number of thin lines in the white fur around the eye to give it texture. Plus, darken a small ring of white fur adjacent to the eye. You do not want to leave the ring of white fur unburned because it doesn't look realistic. Instead, it just looks like you forgot to finish burning in the area. I mentioned before that the outer edge of the white fur needs to be jagged. To accomplish this, it might be helpful to use a writer pin tip and burn short, thin lines along that outer edge. The pin tip can also be used to give the white fur texture. Just make sure to keep the burn marks in the tan range. Another useful function for the writer pin tip is to carefully darken the fur adjacent to the pale gaps along the bottom of the face. It is a lot easier to be precise with a writer pen tip than it is a shader. And that's why I recommend using a writer pen tip for defining those pale hairs. Again, I want to mention I only included those hairs because this was a commission of someone's pet. Otherwise, I would just use the same short fur texture that I used on the rest of the face. And that's what I would recommend for you to do. I don't recommend wasting time on these white hairs. This is the last of the face that I am going to show. From here on out is nothing more than reburning using the same burn strokes and techniques. The dark fur on the ears is very straightforward. Create the fur texture using either the zigzag burn stroke or a series of single lines. This is the same technique that we used on the face, so nothing new or different. Make sure to keep the edges of the dark fur jagged. This is the same thing we've been doing. For example, the ring of white fur around the eye was an area that we needed to keep jagged. So again, this is nothing new or different. With the white fur, first define the lower edge by burning a thin line on the dark body fur. Then burn in the black hairs that lay on top of the white fur. Along the lower part of the ear, I used the zigzag burn stroke and some longer lines. On the rest of the ear, I burned very short, thin lines. Quite truthfully, I did not spend a lot of time on the ears. In fact, I spent so little time on the ear that I didn't do much reburning on it either. With the exception of the dark fur on the lower part of the ear, I left the white fur on the ear as it was. With the dark fur, I reburned over it so that it became a dark brown or black color. Chest. I am going to concentrate on the section of fur circled in green. This section of fur is a spot where it parts, so the fur heads in different directions. Also, the fur is fluffy and a bit matted looking. If you compare my artwork with the photo, you can see I did not replicate the photo texture. If you don't like what I did, skip this chapter and move on to the next one. Otherwise, let me explain what I did. Begin by burning wide bands of color around the part. Make sure to burn them in the direction the fur is parted. So burn strokes above the part are angled towards the upper right, and those below it are angled towards the lower left. Afterwards, burn wide bands of color along the pattern lines. The bands of color do not need to be uniform in color. In fact, mine are far from it. As I am burning, I am using a bit of a zigzag or up-down motion. Since the entire pen tip is in contact with the board, this creates wide streaks of color that are accented with slightly darker blotches here and there. After the pattern lines are burned over, then start burning in the areas between the pattern lines. For this I use the same type of burn strokes, but I often make the color a little darker. Next, start defining the lower edge of the parted hair. Begin by burning a dark thin line to define the outer edge of where you want a lock of hair to be. Then burn the fur adjacent to the lock of hair a darker color than the lock. Essentially, we are creating a shadow underneath the locks of hair. This technique can be used to create any size of lock, from a really thin one to one that is really wide. For example, in the section of fur I'm currently burning in, I'm burning a series of thinner burn strokes to create a number of smaller locks of fur. I purposely burned some lines in slightly different directions to make the fur look messier. And of course you can use the flat of the shader to burn wide strokes of color, but leave curving gaps here and there. The curving gaps become single locks of fur that will appear as highlights compared to the dark fur adjacent to it. Something I did with the chest fur was use a Reiter pin tip and burn thin, dark lines adjacent to the locks of fur. This helped each individual lock of fur stand out. Quite truthfully, I didn't care for how this turned out. If I were to do this over again, I don't think I would do this step. Here is how the chest fur currently looks. Once an area is blocked in, then it is time for the reburning process. Reburn over it using the same techniques and burn strokes. The purpose is to darken and further define the fur. For whatever reason, I decided to do the reburning using a Reiter pin tip. I used the Reiter in the same way I would a shader. I lightly burned over some locks of fur to darken them up. I burned both thin and thick lines to further define existing locks of fur. I also created new locks of fur. All of my efforts did not improve the chest fur noticeably, but at least I made an attempt. Body. If you compare the reference photo with my artwork, you can easily see I did not create an exact replica. Instead, I created more locks or clumps of fur than what the reference photo shows. Also, the fur in my artwork is smoother looking. Regardless of that, my artwork still creates the impression of fur. I will start out by explaining how to create a thin lock of fur or hair. This is done by burning a dark band of color next to the spot where you want that lock of hair to be. The lock of hair ends up looking like a highlight within the hair. Notice how my dark bands of color or wide lines curve. The general direction matches the direction the fur is growing, but the gentle curves add dimension and volume to the fur. Once I have some of the wide lines in place, then I reburn over the area to further define the locks. During this phase, I often make individual locks thinner, and I also create more locks. This is a very free-form way of creating locks. By this I mean I'm not trying to replicate the reference photo. Instead, I'm just creating random locks of fur as I burn. Now I do realize that depending on your experience level, you may not be very comfortable with this approach. There is an alternative way of making a lock of fur that might be easier for you, so let me show you that. Use a white charcoal pencil to draw in the thin locks of fur. I am using General's brand of charcoal. Do not use colored pencils. The reason is that colored pencils contain wax and oils that will melt and char under the heat of the pen tip. Once the lines are drawn in, then carefully burn around the charcoal marks. Avoid burning over the charcoal. While the charcoal is resistant to the heat of the pen tip, it won't block it completely. The purpose of the white charcoal is to mark the location of a thin lock of fur or a highlight. The white charcoal is easy to see, and that makes it easy to avoid. I do want to mention that you should erase the white charcoal the minute it is no longer needed. I have found that the longer the charcoal is in contact with the board, the harder it is to remove all traces of it. Try to keep the contact time between the white charcoal and the board to under 60 minutes. If needed, draw fewer thin locks. Burn around those locks, then erase the charcoal and repeat. Once the charcoal has been burned around and erased, then it is time for the reburning process. During this time, I further define the thin locks of fur. To define the locks, I burn darker around them. A lot of times I make them thinner. I may shorten or reduce how long they are, and sometimes I add more thin locks. During this entire process, I am burning on the fur adjacent to the thin locks. When the adjacent fur gets dark enough, then I will burn over the locks to reduce their brightness. I don't like to burn over the locks too soon because that makes it harder to see where they're at. This is not a fast process, but quite truthfully, all of my realistic artwork takes time. As I reburn over the fur to darken it, I vary the color of the thin locks. I also vary the color of the adjacent fur. The color variation is not extreme. Currently, I am creating a thin lock of fur that looks like it is laying on the surface of the fur. Plus, this lock of fur sticks out in a different direction. I have an arrow pointing to the lock I'm referring to. To create this top lock, I carefully burn all the adjacent fur and adjacent thin locks to a darker color than what the top lock is. I slowly work my way around the thin locks that were drawn with the white charcoal. I make the fur behind the locks darker than the thin locks. Then I vary how dark each of the thin locks are. The darker the lock is in color, the further away from the fur surface it will appear. Or maybe I should state that as darker colors appear further away than lighter colors do. I'm not going to show any more of the thin locks being created. At this point, all I am doing is reburning over the area numerous times until the overall color is as dark as I want it to be. Let's create clumps of fur. A clump is just my term that refers to a large section of hair or fur. I will be explaining the area that's circled in the inset photo. This area has several clumps that vary in size. I am burning a series of wide, curved lines where I want a clump of fur to be. Initially, the lines are burned on the adjacent fur. This is the same thing that we did when creating thin locks. After the adjacent fur is blocked in, then I start adding the wide lines to the clump of fur. The wide lines are not very dark in color. Also, the color varies a little. These wide lines are creating the foundation for the shape of the fur in this area. Each wide line represents a group of numerous individual hairs. Because I am creating a clump of fur, I burn the lines on each clump in the same general direction. After the area is blocked in, then starts the reburning process. One of the main goals during this time is to darken the fur adjacent to the clump. When I reburn over the clump, I work the ends of the clump. This means that each burn stroke starts on the end of a clump and gets pulled towards the center of that clump. That will make the center of the clump the palest area on the clump. That pale center, combined with the darker edges, gives the clump a curved or bowed appearance. Another thing I do is burn the root end of the clump darker than the outer end. The root end is where the fur emerges from the rabbit's body. The outer end is where the clump of fur ends. The reason I make the root end darker is that it creates a shadow that the clump of fur emerges from. Shadow isn't the best word, but it's the only thing I could think of. Let me put it a different way. The shadowed root area creates density. It gives the appearance that this section of fur is rising up from the rabbit's skin, but the fur is so thick or dense, we can't see the skin. I have created 3 separate clumps of fur in the area I'm burning. I've circled each clump. What needs to be done now is reburning over the fur to further define the clumps and to darken up the overall color of the fur. I will mention that if I was creating a rabbit with white fur, I wouldn't make the fur much darker than it currently is. Since this rabbit has black fur, I need to do a lot of reburning. This involves reburning over the adjacent fur to help each clump of fur stand out. Plus, I reburn over each clump, adding some thinner lines to give it more texture and detail. Watch as I easily alter the shape of the lower clump of fur. Depending on your experience level, you may not feel comfortable creating or altering clumps of fur without a guide. If that is the case, I would recommend using white charcoal to draw the outline of the fur clump. Then fill in the clump with wide burn strokes. Make the ends of the clump darker than the center of it. Once the clump is blocked in, erase the charcoal and draw a new one. Repeat this process until the rabbit fur is done. Hopefully you noticed that the outer end of each fur clump has either a jagged edge or it comes to a soft, tapered point. I personally think that this looks more realistic than having it end with a straight edge. I have sped up the video for 3 reasons. 1. The burn stroke does not change. 2. I'm running out of things to say. And 3. To help cut down on the video length. At this point, all I am doing is reburning over the area to darken the fur. This is done by using the flat of the shader to burn wide lines. During the reburning process, I will further define individual clumps of fur by darkening the fur adjacent to the clump. I also give individual clumps more texture by burning more wide lines over it that vary in width and color. This gives a clump more tonal variety. As I reburn over an individual clump, I make sure to keep the edges darker than the center. I don't want to lose that curved look that the clump has. How curved or bowed the clump looks is controlled by contrast between the edges and the center of the clump. The higher the contrast, the more bowed it will appear. The opposite is also true. The lower the contrast is, the flatter it will appear. If there is no contrast, so that the color is uniform throughout the clump will look flat. To help you visualize what I'm trying to explain, compare the inset photos along the right of the screen. The top photo shows a clump that has a slight bow. The middle or second photo, the outer end of the clump has been darkened up. Notice how that gives a more bowed appearance to the clump. In the bottom photo, both ends of the clump have been darkened up. This makes the bow even more pronounced. Once I burn over the center of this clump, the appearance of the bow decreases a little. If you compare this clump with the one to the left one looks a little flatter. Now compare the 2 upper clumps with the lower one, and the lower clump looks flat. And that's because the lower clump has very little contrast on it. It's mostly uniform in color. This is all I am going to show on this area. The only thing that happens at this point is I continue to reburn over the area numerous times until the fur is a very dark color. During the numerous reburnings, I do break up the clumps, making them smaller. There's nothing remarkable about it, and nothing that you can't handle. The last area of fur I will explain is the lower body fur. This fur is longer and has a slight curve or wave to it. If you compare my artwork with the reference photo, you can easily see that my artwork is not an exact replica of the photo. Instead, my artwork is loosely based on the photo. Begin by burning wide lines to give the area shape. I use the flat of the shader for this. It is important to burn the wide lines in the direction the fur is shaped. If you are using my pattern, then follow the pattern lines, which is what I am doing. We are blocking in the area, so keep your burn strokes on the lighter side. I just created a thin lock of fur by burning a line around the edge of where I want that thin lock to be. After the edge of the lock was defined, then I resumed working on the fur behind it. I am very careful to avoid burning over that thin lock of fur. I want that thin lock to look like it is sitting on top of the body fur. As I block in the long body fur, the burn methods and techniques I use are extremely similar to the large clumps that I just finished demonstrating. All I am doing is burning wide lines that vary in width and color that follow the direction the fur is growing. This is the same thing that I did with the large clumps. The difference is that the fur is longer and it doesn't have as many clearly defined sections to it. Even though the fur is longer, I don't burn really long strokes of color. Instead, I burn shorter lines and work in smaller areas at a time. Eventually, the lines connect and that creates the long fur. That said, keep in mind that I am just explaining how I do things. That does not mean it is the only way or even the best way to create the fur texture. I highly recommend you watch other pyrographers explain their methods, then incorporate the aspects of each style that works best for you. The great thing is that the pyrography art form is gaining in popularity, so there are getting to be more and more channels dedicated to pyrography. As you can see, I continue to create thin locks of fur here and there. These thin locks appear to be sitting on the surface of the fur. Once a thin lock is in place, then I carefully avoid burning over that lock as I work on the long body fur. Are these thin locks really necessary? No. I include them because it gives the fur a slightly messy appearance I see in the reference photo. My interpretation of that messy appearance does not match exactly with the reference photo, but let's be truthful, very little of my artwork is an exact replica of the reference photo. I am almost done blocking in the fur. Once the fur is blocked in, then it is a matter of reburning over it until the fur is as dark as I want it to be. It usually takes me 3 to 4 times of reburning over the fur before I achieve the darkness level that I want. During the reburning, I use the same burn strokes and techniques that I used during the blocking in stage. There is nothing new or unique that happens during this phase of creating the artwork. Because of that, I have sped up the video by a considerable amount. Since all I am doing is burning lines that vary in width, length, and color, I think you can still tell what is going on even though the video is sped up. The technique I'm showing you for the long body fur can be used on anything with long fur or hair, including portrait work. Hair or fur, like I'm creating in the video, isn't about burning lots of individual hairs. Instead, it is about burning wide bands of color that follow the shape of the hair. These wide bands of color are what I have also been referring to as wide lines. The wide bands or lines need to vary in color. The color variation does not need to be extreme, but it is very important to have some color variation. The reason is that the color variation forms the texture that gives the impression of hair. If it is at all possible, break down the hair into smaller sections. Then work one section at a time. This makes the process of creating hair less intimidating and easier to do. I don't think anything more can be learned from watching me reburn over the fur numerous times. To finish this section of the tutorial, I'm sharing progress photos of the body being burned in. Some people find these types of photos to be very helpful. The photos will be available on the blog that I wrote for this artwork, and I will put a link to the blog in the video description. The last thing I will show is that I used the tip of a sharp knife to create some of the white hairs and the highlights found on the fur. I don't think it turned out real well, so it's up to you if you want to mimic that or not. Well, that is it for this tutorial. I hope you found the information helpful. As I said before, on my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I do have a written version of this tutorial, and that blog will have the reference photo and a free pattern, and a link to that blog will be in the video description. Well, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you soon.